Hey, this is Anthony,
And this is Tyler.
and we did our project on a higher obligation to justice, an examination and refutation of Socrates' argument for his own death. Socrates' argument can be summed up in 6 points. 1. Socrates has agreed to abide by the laws. 2. To refuse to abide by the laws is to break the agreement. 3. It is not right to break an agreement. 4. If Socrates escapes, he breaks the agreement. 5. Socrates ought not escape. And 6. Socrates ought to drink the hemlock. A summary of our argument is that we refute the validity of the social contract theory and instead advance a position that Socrates has a higher obligation to the improvement of justness of society. Therefore, he should not drink the hemlock and should escape.
Okay, so premise one that Socrates has agreed to abide by the laws, we find to be unsound. So maybe Socrates thought that he agreed to abide by the laws, as exemplified by his assurance to Crito that he tacitly consented to the rule of Athens. But we cannot be sure of this agreement because there are many factors that could have prevented him from leaving Athens throughout his life. Chiefly, the fact that it would not really make sense for him to leave when all of his valuables, family, and things he holds dear are inside of Athens. And additionally, where would he go? Athens was a large polis, and it may have hurt him more than it helped him to leave the city, if this was to be the case. So, disagreement with the laws of a particular polis or government does not necessitate leaving the confines of their jurisdiction. For a more modern and relatable example, a person living in the United States today may not agree with all of the laws set forth by the Constitution and our government, and even might rather live somewhere else like Copenhagen or something, where governance is more in line with their personal political philosophy. But they probably will not leave. Too much financial damage, emotional damage, for example, stress, would come to them, and they might consider the benefits of staying and living under an unjust government to be more than the benefits of moving to a more just one, but losing many of one's valuables and this proximity to loved ones along the way. So, to this same point, John Simmons holds in his argument from tacit consent that an agreement is valid only if it meets certain conditions. The fifth of these conditions being the consequences of dissent cannot be extremely detrimental to the consenter. He then goes on to claim that immigration routinely has consequences sufficiently unpleasant to make any formal political choice procedures fail our condition 5. So therefore, Socrates has not necessarily agreed to abide by the laws. Just because he's taken residence and has displayed continued residence in Athens does not mean that he is tacitly willing to abide by all of the government's laws.
A counter argument can be made to our point and Simmons that not all high costs invalidate consent. The argument would be, in the case of Socrates, that just because it may have been very costly for him to leave Athens and meet with possible uncomfortable scenarios of readjustment and novelty does not mean that he isn't assumed to have given tacit consent. However, it is generally accepted that consent for a social contract theory needs to have been given knowingly, intentionally, and voluntarily. The criterion for voluntarily is of particular interest to us here. In his conversation with Crito, he may have given his consent knowingly and intentionally, but to have given it voluntarily, he must have acted of his own free will for the duration of his life in staying within the confines of Athens. We do not get much information about the life of Socrates prior to the timeline of events contained within the Platonic dialogues, so we do not know if he was always a voluntary member of Athenian society. We know that he likely enjoyed the benefits of society at times, but it still does not follow that he was always a voluntary member. The point by Simmons that the costs of immigration cannot be higher than its benefits further defends our rebuttal. It is entirely possible that Socrates found the cost of leaving to be too high, and this ambiguity does not allow for us to conclude that he has rightly agreed to abide by the laws.
Okay, so premise two, to refuse to abide by the laws is to break an agreement. It doesn't really matter to our argument because, as was just established, if he refuses to abide by the laws and he leaves Athens, evading his death, he's not breaking the agreement because one was never made in the first place. So this is unsound. Okay, so for premise three, it is not right to break an agreement. Okay, so to preface the main bulk of our argument, the central problem of Socrates' trial for us is his being unjustly accused of a crime on the charges of corrupting the youth. So he knows that he didn't commit this crime because, as you can see in the apology, he says, I was the sort of person who never agreed to anything with anyone contrary to justice. So Socrates saw himself as the embodiment of justness. He saw himself as the virtuous, um, which was, the validity of his mission was proven absolutely by the statement of the oracle that he was the wisest man in Athens. So he knows himself that he did no such thing. He simply encouraged them to think for themselves instead of assuming and taking what they heard at face value. For example, the gods of the Greek mythos, the nature of virtue and knowledge, etc. Um, but however, Socrates thinks he should stay and submit to the authority requiring his death because his high obligation is to be virtuous before God in this divine mission. In the Crito, his beliefs about virtue are in accordance with the words of the personified laws and represent one of the earliest formulations of a social contract theory. So this is where the problem comes in.
So this is the quote where we see the main problem in Socrates' reasoning. Socrates asks Crito, should one do the things one has agreed with someone to do, provided they are just, or should one cheat? We believe that the largest mistake made by Socrates in his line of reasoning was his assumption that the laws of Athens are just, and that his God would want him to obey these laws, and his subsequent efforts to base his entire argument on this assumption. However, his mistake is assuming the justness of Athenian laws because the laws of Athens were by no means just. Just because the laws allowed him to individually flourish and enjoy the benefits of society, along with education, health, etc., does not mean that the laws were just for everyone. Upon examination of Athenian society with the laws under which Socrates was prosecuted, many of those being ruled did not have the same rights as the rulers. Slaves, which made up about 1/3 of Athens' population, were mostly treated as property. They could be bought, sold, and beaten, and legal actions for offenses against the slave had to be brought by the slave's master. Similarly, women had few rights in Athenian democracy. They could not inherit property, and they could not achieve political rights. Excluding too large portions of the population from participating in a democratic society is innately unjust.
Okay, so a modern counter argument to ours, coming from John Cartledge of the University of Cambridge, amongst other modern thinkers, is that actually Socrates was justly charged because the most important thing to them is the exercising and upkeep of democracy. Um, this argument believes that Socrates' trial was an example of democratic values being strengthened, and showing how people can come together for the good of their society. It holds that the upkeep of democracy is more important than the progression of society in general.
Our rebuttal to this is that while it is good for citizens to come together to work on behalf of the whole society, why should we take such a stagnant stance and hold that the simple upkeep of democracy is more important than moral progression? It is much more important that women come to possess the same rights as men and that slaves stop being treated like property than for the people who get to participate in democracy to continue participating in it. Our entire argument revolves around the fact that because Socrates was unjustly indicted and Athenian society additionally was unjust, he should escape and not obey these laws. Socrates finds it important to obey only the laws that are just, and when multiple laws of his society are unjust, how can he claim to their being just?
Okay, so the remaining three premises, premise 4, 5, and 6, aren't really relevant. If Socrates escapes, he breaks agreement. Like we've said, he hasn't broken agreement because there was never an agreement in the first place. 5, we defended the fact that he should escape, and 6, we defended the fact that he should not drink the hemlock. So that's all accounted for. So in all, Socrates' argument, we basically said that every premise is unsound and the whole structure of the argument is invalid.
In conclusion, the social contract theory is not enough to give Socrates the obligation to obey the laws within his polis. Additionally, Socrates has a higher obligation to promote ubiquitous justice for everyone, not just for men within Athens. This overrules his obligation to obey the authority that requests his death.